The early morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Devonshire, curling around the ancient oaks that lined the path to Highbury Hall. The grand estate, nestled deep within the English countryside, had stood for centuries, its grey stone walls bearing witness to countless seasons and the lives of those who called it home. Lady Evelyn Marwood, the only daughter of the late Earl of Highbury, stood on the balcony of her chambers, the cool breeze teasing the loose strands of her chestnut hair. Her eyes, a deep green that mirrored the lush fields below, were fixed on the distant horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise. The world was waking up, yet Evelyn felt a sense of unease that had plagued her since the arrival of a letter a week prior. The letter, bearing the seal of a distant cousin she had never met, informed her of an impending visit from a Mr. Arthur Sinclair. He was a man of considerable wealth and, according to the letter, had been abroad for many years, only recently returning to England. The letter spoke of a connection between their families, though Evelyn had no memory of ever hearing his name mentioned before. The letter also mentioned that Mr. Sinclair was considering purchasing an estate nearby, and it was deemed proper that he should stay at Highbury Hall during his visit. Though she was the mistress of the house, Evelyn had little say in the matter. Her uncle, Lord Henry Marwood, who had taken over the estate after her father's untimely death, insisted on hosting Mr. Sinclair. Evelyn sighed, feeling a pang of melancholy as she turned away from the view. Her father had been her world, and after his passing, she had found herself increasingly isolated, with her uncle making most of the decisions regarding the estate and her future. Though he was not unkind, Lord Henry was a practical man, far more concerned with the estate's finances than with the happiness of his niece. There was a soft knock on the door, and Evelyn's maid Margaret entered the room. "Lady Evelyn, the preparations for Mr. Sinclair's arrival are nearly complete. Is there anything else you require?" Margaret asked, her tone respectful yet warm. She had been with Evelyn since childhood, and their relationship was more akin to that of sisters than mistress and servant. "No, Margaret, I think everything is in order," Evelyn replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "I just hope that this Mr. Sinclair is not as dreadful as I imagine him to be." Margaret suppressed a smile. "Perhaps he will surprise you, my lady. It's not every day we have a visitor from London. Maybe he'll bring some excitement to Highbury." Ellen arched an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Excitement is the last thing I need, but I suppose we shall see." As Margaret helped her dress for the day, Evelyn's mind wandered. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Sinclair's visit would change everything, though she could not yet fathom how. The day of Mr. Sinclair's arrival dawned bright and clear, the mist of the previous morning replaced by a crisp, autumnal chill. The estate was abuzz with activity as servants scurried to and fro, ensuring that every detail was perfect. The grand dining room was laid out with the finest china, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. Evelyn stood in the drawing room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as she waited for the sound of carriage wheels on the gravel drive. She had chosen a simple yet elegant gown of the deep burgundy, the color highlighting the warmth in her complexion. Despite her best efforts to remain calm, she felt her heart racing as the moment of Mr. Sinclair's arrival drew near. When the sound finally came, it was accompanied by the clatter of hooves and the low murmur of voices. Evelyn took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the doorway. Moments later, the doors were flung open, and Lord Henry entered, followed by a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. "Lady Evelyn, may I present Mr. Arthur Sinclair?" Lord Henry announced, his tone formal. Evelyn curtsied gracefully, her gaze briefly meeting Mr. Sinclair's before she lowered her eyes. "Welcome to Highbury Hall, Mr. Sinclair. I trust your journey was pleasant." Mr. Sinclair bowed, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, Lady Evelyn. The journey was indeed pleasant, though I must say it pales in comparison to the beauty of Highbury." Evelyn felt a flush of warmth rise to her cheeks at the compliment, though she quickly regained her composure. "You are kind, sir. I hope you find your stay here comfortable." Lord Henry, sensing the tension, stepped forward. "Come, Mr. Sinclair, let me show you to your quarters. You must be in need of rest after your travels." As the two men left the room, Evelyn allowed herself a moment to collect her thoughts. Mr. Sinclair was not what she had expected. He was younger, perhaps in his early 30s, with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Yet there was something about him, a sense of mystery that intrigued her, despite herself. Over the next few days, Evelyn found herself in Mr. Sinclair's company more often than she had anticipated. He was charming, with a quick wit and a way of making her laugh that she hadn't experienced in years. They spoke of books, music, and the state of the world, and though they often disagreed, their conversations were lively and stimulating. Despite her initial reservations, Evelyn found herself drawn to Mr. Sinclair. There was a darkness in him, a sense that he had seen and experienced more than most men of his age. He spoke little of his time abroad, and when he did, there was a shadow in his eyes that made her wonder what secrets he was hiding. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Evelyn and Mr. Sinclair grew. It was unspoken, a simmering undercurrent that neither dared to acknowledge. Evelyn was acutely aware of the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, and she couldn't deny the thrill it gave her. The tension came to a head on the night of the autumn ball, a grand event that brought together the most prominent families in the county. Highbury Hall was transformed, with the ballroom adorned with garlands of autumn leaves and flickering candles that cast a warm glow over the room. Evelyn, dressed in a gown of emerald silk that shimmered in the candlelight, felt like she was walking in a dream. The music, the laughter, the swirl of colorful gowns, it was all so intoxicating. Yet, amidst the revelry, her thoughts kept returning to Mr. Sinclair. She found him standing by the window, his gaze distant as he looked out at the moonlit gardens. Without thinking, Evelyn approached him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mr. Sinclair," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, the air between them thick with unspoken words. "Lady Evelyn," he replied, his voice low and velvety. "You look beautiful tonight." Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat. "Thank you." As she hesitated, unsure of what to say, the words she had rehearsed in her mind seemed to have deserted her. Arthur took a step closer, his gaze intense. "There's something I need to tell you, something I've been keeping from you." Evelyn's heart raced, a mixture of fear and anticipation coursing through her veins. "What is it?" Arthur hesitated, his expression conflicted. "When I came here, it was not just to purchase an estate. There is another reason, one that concerns you." Evelyn's voice trembled. "What do you mean?" Arthur reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I have been sent here by your uncle. He wishes for us to marry." Evelyn felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Marry? But why? Why would my uncle?" Arthur cut her off, his voice urgent. "Your uncle is deeply in debt, Lady Evelyn. He needs my fortune to save the estate. Our marriage was supposed to be a business arrangement, nothing more." "But," he trailed off, his gaze searching hers. "But what?" Evelyn whispered, her heart in her throat. Arthur's expression softened, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. "But I find that I cannot go through with it. Not like this. I do not want to marry you out of obligation or duty. I want to marry you because I have fallen in love with you." Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes, a whirlwind of emotions surging within her. She had sensed that something was amiss, but she had never imagined this. "Arthur, Before she could finish, the sound of raised voices reached their ears. They both turned towards the doorway, where Lord Henry stood, his face red with anger. "So, it's true," he spat, his eyes blazing. "You've told her." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. "Uncle, what is the meaning of this?" Lord Henry ignored her, his focus entirely on Arthur. "You fool, do you think you can just walk away from this? The deal is made. You will marry my niece, or you will face the consequences." Arthur stepped protectively in front of Evelyn. "I will not be coerced into a loveless marriage, Lord Henry, and I will not allow you to use your niece as a pawn in your games." Lord Henry's face twisted with rage. "You think you can defy me? You have no idea who you're dealing with, Sinclair." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. She had never seen her uncle like this, and the realization of how deep his desperation ran terrified her. "Uncle, please, this isn't right." Lord Henry turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Evelyn, my dear, you don't understand. I'm doing this for you, for your future. Without this marriage, Highbury will be lost. Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. I don't care about the estate, uncle. I care about my happiness, about love. And I won't be forced into a marriage I don't want. Arthur squeezed her hand, his expression resolute. Neither will I for a moment. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, with a cold sneer, Lord Henry spoke. Very well. If you refuse to marry, then you leave me no choice. I will ruin you both. With that, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, leaving Evelyn and Arthur standing in stunned silence. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and fear. Lord Henry's threat loomed over them like a dark cloud, and Evelyn found herself questioning everything she had ever known. How could the man who had raised her, who had taken her in after her father's death, be capable of such cruelty? Arthur, too, was troubled. He had not expected to fall in love with Evelyn, and now that he had, he was determined to protect her at all costs. But he knew that defying Lord Henry would not be easy. The man was powerful, with connections that reached far beyond Devonshire. It was during one of their secret meetings in the gardens that Arthur finally revealed the full extent of the situation. They sat beneath a towering oak tree, the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves above them. Evelyn, there's something you need to know, Arthur began, his tone serious. Your uncle, he's not just in debt. He's involved in something much darker. Evelyn frowned, her heart sinking. What do you mean? Arthur hesitated, as if unsure of how to continue. Lord Henry has been involved in illegal dealings for years. Smuggling, extortion, you name it. He's built a fortune on the backs of others. And now, it's all falling apart. That's why he's so desperate to secure our marriage. He needs my money to cover his tracks. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea wash over her. But how do you know this? Arthur looked away, his expression troubled. Because I was once involved in it too. Before I left England, I was part of your uncle's operation. But I couldn't continue. I saw the harm we were causing, the lives we were destroying, and I couldn't live with myself. That's why I left, why I went abroad. I thought I could escape it. But now, it's all coming back. Evelyn stared at him, her mind reeling. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? Because I was afraid, Arthur admitted, his voice heavy with regret. Afraid that you would hate me, that you would see me as no better than your uncle. But I couldn't keep it from you any longer. You deserve to know the truth. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, a mixture of anger, fear, and betrayal swirling within her. But as she looked at Arthur, she saw the pain in his eyes, the guilt that had been eating away at him for years. He had made mistakes, terrible ones, but he was trying to make amends. She reached out, placing a hand on his cheek. Arthur, I don't hate you. I could never hate you. You made a mistake, but you're trying to make it right. That's what matters. Arthur covered her hand with his own, his eyes filled with gratitude. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Evelyn, but I will do everything in my power to protect you, to make sure your uncle pays for what he's done. Evelyn nodded, her resolve hardening. We'll face this together, Arthur. We'll find a way to stop him. But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. As the days passed, Evelyn and Arthur began to make plans to expose Lord Henry's crimes. They knew it would be dangerous, that their lives could be at risk, but they were determined to see justice done. They spent hours in the library, poring over documents and letters, searching for any evidence they could use. Arthur reached out to contacts he had made during his time abroad, people who could help them bring Lord Henry to justice. But Lord Henry was not a man to be underestimated. He was cunning and ruthless, and it wasn't long before he realized what they were up to. One evening, as Evelyn and Arthur were returning from a secret meeting in the village, they were ambushed by a group of men loyal to Lord Henry. Evelyn's heart raced as they were dragged from their carriage and taken to a remote part of the estate. The men were rough, their faces hidden beneath hoods, and Evelyn knew that they were in grave danger. Let her go, Arthur demanded, his voice filled with anger. This is between me and Lord Henry. She has nothing to do with this. One of the men stepped forward, his voice cold and mocking. Oh, she has everything to do with this, Mr. Sinclair. You both do. Lord Henry wants to send a message, and he's chosen you to deliver it. Before they could react, the men attacked. Arthur fought valiantly, but he was outnumbered, and Evelyn could only watch in horror as he was beaten to the ground. Just as the situation seemed hopeless, a loud whistle pierced the air. The men froze, their heads snapping towards the sound. Moments later, a group of villagers, armed with makeshift weapons, emerged from the trees. "Leave them be, or you'll answer to us," one of the villagers shouted, his voice filled with determination. The men hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance. With a final glance at each other, they fled into the night, leaving Evelyn and Arthur bruised but alive. As the villagers helped them to their feet, Evelyn felt a surge of gratitude. These were the people her uncle had exploited for years, yet they had risked their lives to save her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The villager who had spoken earlier, a burly man with a kind face, smiled at her. "You've always been good to us, Lady Evelyn. We're just returning the favor." Arthur, still bleeding from a cut above his eye, turned to Evelyn, his expression grim. "We need to leave. Tonight? It's not safe here anymore." Evelyn nodded, her heart heavy. "Where will we go?" Arthur hesitated for a moment before replying. "I know a place. Somewhere your uncle can't reach us. But we need to move quickly." With the help of the villagers, they gathered what few belongings they could carry and set off into the night. As they left Highbury Hall behind, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a pang of sorrow. This had been her home, the place where she had grown up, and now she was being forced to flee from it. But as she glanced at Arthur, who walked beside her, his hand tightly gripping hers, she knew that she was doing the right thing. They were walking into the unknown, but they were doing it together, and that gave her the strength to keep going. Arthur led Evelyn through the dense woods, the moonlight barely filtering through the thick canopy above. They walked for hours, the sounds of the night surrounding them, owls hooting, leaves rustling, and the distant murmur of a stream. Evelyn's legs ached, but she refused to complain. She knew that they couldn't afford to stop, not until they were safe. Arthur had been silent for most of the journey, his expression tense, and she could sense the weight of the responsibility he felt. Finally, just as exhaustion threatened to overtake her, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood a modest cottage, its stone walls weathered but sturdy. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a warm light glowed from the windows. "This is it," Arthur said, his voice low. "It's not much, but it's safe. No one knows about this place." Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her as they approached the cottage. It was small, but it was a refuge, a place where they could rest and regroup. Inside, the cottage was cozy and welcoming. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. There was a table with 2 chairs, a small kitchen area, and a bed tucked into the corner. Arthur led Evelyn to the bed, where she sat down, her legs finally giving out. He knelt beside her, his expression softening. "You should rest, Evelyn. You've been through so much." Evelyn shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "I can't rest, Arthur. I'm so afraid. What if he finds us? What if..." Arthur took her hands in his touch gentle but firm. "He won't find us. Not here. I promise you, Evelyn. I will do everything in my power to keep you safe." She looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity in them, and felt a flicker of hope. Despite everything they had been through, Arthur had never wavered in his commitment to her. He had risked his life to protect her, and she knew that she could trust him with her heart. As he leaned in to kiss her, Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her, chasing away the cold fear that had gripped her for so long. This was what she had been searching for, what she had longed for. What she had longed for. Not the security of an estate or the comfort of wealth, but the love of a man who would stand by her, no matter the cost. For the first time in what felt like forever, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that they could have a future together, that they could build a new life, far away from the shadows of Highbury Hall and the dark secrets that had threatened to destroy them. And as they lay together in the quiet of the night, the fire casting a soft glow around them, Evelyn whispered a silent vow to herself. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with Arthur by her side. Together, they would overcome the past and forge a new beginning. But the peace they found in the cottage was short-lived. Though they had escaped the immediate danger, Evelyn and Arthur knew that Lord Henry would not give up so easily. His pride had been wounded, and his wrath was something to be feared. Days turned into weeks, and though they remained hidden, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Arthur assured her that they were safe, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed his own unease. It wasn't long before their fears were realized. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a loud knock echoed through the cottage. Arthur's hand immediately went to the knife he kept by his side, and Evelyn's heart raced as she watched him approach the door. "Who's there?" Arthur called, his voice tense. There was a long pause, and then a familiar voice replied, "It's me, Arthur. Open the door." Evelyn's eyes widened as she recognized the voice. It was Thomas, Arthur's old friend and confidant. The last time they had seen him was when they had left Highbury Hall, and he had helped them escape. Arthur opened the door cautiously, and Thomas stepped inside, his face drawn and serious. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "What's happened?" Arthur asked, his tone grim. Thomas glanced at Evelyn, his expression softening slightly before he turned back to Arthur. "Lord Henry knows where you are. He's been asking around, paying off villagers for information. It's only a matter of time before he finds this place." Evelyn felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "But how? We've been so careful." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He's more resourceful than we gave him credit for. And he's desperate, Arthur. He's not just after you for defying him, he's after you because you're the last person who can expose him." Arthur clenched his fists, his jaw tight. "We can't stay here, then. We need to leave." Thomas shook his head. "Running won't solve this. As long as Lord Henry is free, you'll never be safe. You need to take him down, once and for all." Evelyn, as heart pounded in her chest. The idea of confronting her uncle, of facing him after everything he had done, filled her with dread. But she knew that Thomas was right. They couldn't keep running forever. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Thomas looked at her, admiration in his eyes. "We gather evidence, enough to bring him to trial, but it won't be easy. Lord Henry has powerful friends, and he'll do anything to protect himself." Arthur nodded, determination etched on his face. "Then we'll do whatever it takes. We can't let him continue to hurt people." Evelyn reached out, taking Arthur's hand in hers. "We'll face this together, Arthur. I'm not going to let him win." And so, with a new resolve, they began to plan. The road ahead would be dangerous, filled with uncertainty, but Evelyn knew that they had no other choice. Lord Henry's reign of terror had to end, and they were the only ones who could stop him. As the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows around the room, Evelyn felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The fear was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but it was tempered by the knowledge that she was not alone. With Arthur and Thomas by her side, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would expose the truth, no matter the cost. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Arthur and Evelyn, with Thomas's help, began gathering evidence against Lord Henry. They scoured the estate, searching for hidden ledgers, secret correspondence, anything that could be used to bring him to justice. It was a dangerous game they were playing, and they knew it. Lord Henry was a cunning man, and if he caught wind of their plans, there would be no mercy. One evening, as they were sifting through old documents in the cottage, Arthur suddenly froze, holding up a letter. "Evelyn, look at this." Evelyn leaned over to read the letter, her eyes widening as she recognized the handwriting. It was her father's. The letter was dated years before his death, and it was addressed to Lord Henry. In it, her father spoke of a debt he owed, a debt that Lord Henry had taken over. The letter hinted at a partnership, one that involved the very same illegal activities that Arthur had spoken of. But what shocked Evelyn the most was the final line of the letter. "I fear for my life, Henry. If anything should happen to me, know that my daughter is to be protected at all costs." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. My father knew. He knew what Lord Henry was involved in, and he was afraid. Arthur's expression was grim as he folded the letter. "This could be the key we need, Evelyn. If we can prove that your uncle was responsible for your father's death, it could bring everything down." But before they could discuss it further, there was a loud crash from outside. They exchanged a look of alarm, and Arthur quickly extinguished the fire in the hearth, stay here," he whispered to Evelyn, his eyes filled with concern. "Thomas and I will check it out," Evelyn nodded, her heart racing. She watched as Arthur and Thomas quietly slipped out of the cottage, their weapons at the ready. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Evelyn's mind raced with fear and worry, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to panic, not now. Suddenly, there was a shout from outside, followed by the sound of a struggle. Evelyn's blood ran cold as she heard Arthur's voice, filled with anger and desperation. Without thinking, she grabbed a small dagger from the table and ran to the door. She couldn't just sit and wait. Arthur needed her. As she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were focused on the scene in front of her. Arthur and Thomas were grappling with several of Lord Henry's men, their faces twisted in grim determination. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She rushed forward, aiming the dagger at the closest man. He turned just in time to see her, but not quickly enough to stop her. The blade sank into his side, and he crumpled to the ground with a groan. Arthur glanced at her, his expression a mixture of shock and relief. "Evelyn, get back inside." But Evelyn shook her head, her grip tightening on the dagger. "I'm not leaving you, Arthur. We're in this together." With renewed determination, they fought off the remaining men, their movements quick and precise. The battle was fierce, but eventually, Lord Henry's men began to retreat, realizing that they were outmatched. As the last of them fled into the night, Evelyn felt her knees give out beneath her. Arthur caught her just in time, pulling her into his arms. "It's over," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "We did it, Evelyn." But as she looked into his eyes, she knew that it wasn't over yet. Lord Henry was still out there, still a threat, and until he was brought to justice, they would never be truly free. The following weeks were a blur of preparation and anxiety. With the evidence they had gathered, Arthur and Evelyn were ready to bring Lord Henry to trial. It was a risky move, but they had no other choice. It was the only way to ensure their safety and to bring justice for all those who had suffered at Lord Henry's hands. The trial was held in London in a grand courtroom filled with spectators. News of the scandal had spread, and the case had become the talk of the town. Evelyn and Arthur sat side by side, their hands clasped together, as they watched the proceedings unfold. Lord Henry, who had been arrested shortly after the confrontation at the cottage, stood in the dock, his face a mask of arrogance. He showed no remorse, no fear, as the charges were read out. But Evelyn could see the flicker of anger in his eyes as the evidence was presented, piece by piece. It was a long and grueling trial, filled with testimonies from witnesses and experts. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, and Evelyn could feel the weight of every word that was spoken. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, the verdict was reached. The judge, a stern man with a commanding presence, looked down at Lord Henry, his expression unreadable. "Lord Henry Montgomery," he began, his voice echoing through the courtroom, "you have been found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and the murder of your brother, Sir Charles Montgomery. You have shown no remorse for your actions, and the court finds your crimes to be of the most serious nature." Evelyn held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment that would determine their future. The judge continued, his tone resolute. "You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your days in the Tower of London, where you will have ample time to reflect on the consequences of your actions." There was a collective gasp from the spectators, and Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was over. The man who had caused so much pain and suffering was finally being held accountable. Arthur squeezed her hand, a small smile playing on his lips. "We did it, Evelyn. We brought him down." Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, overcome with emotion. They had fought so hard, endured so much, and now, they could finally begin to heal. As they left the courtroom, the sun shining down on them, Evelyn felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in years. The shadows of the past were finally lifting, and for the first time, she could see a future filled with hope and happiness. Arthur wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Let's go home, Evelyn. We have a new life to start." And with that, they walked away from the courthouse, leaving behind the darkness of Highbury Hall and stepping into the light of a new beginning.